Hello, and welcome to the Watcher's review of the Talons of Weng-Chiang, story of Chinese mythology and a time-travelling criminal in the middle of East End London during the Victorian era. Please be aware there are potential spoilers ahead. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you can be alerted for more content. The Doctor decides to show Leela how her ancestors were entertained during the late 19th century. But the pair end up getting embroiled with the disappearance of young women and a Chinese crime syndicate operated by a criminal from the future, posing as a god. The story is well known for the Fourth Doctor departing from his iconic hat and scarf outfit in favour of an Inverness cape and deerstalker hat, initially to blend in with the people from 19th century London by posing as a distinguished gentleman, but later as a nod to Sherlock Holmes, within giving the people the impression that he is a private investigator on the chase of the disappearance of the young women. Beyond that, you have the usual Fourth Doctor persona, in particular of the Hinchcliffe era, with his eccentric nature catching people off guard, in particular with Jago when he performs some conjuring tricks to get his attention and to win him over, as well as Professor Litefoot with his offbeat quips such as "sleep being for tortoises," when he stays up all night trying to locate the hideout of the Weng-Chiang imposter, and baffling Lightfoot with information about the time cabinet in his house and how he shared a salmon with the venerable bead that was caught in the covered-up River Fleet. Although baffling and confusing the likes of Jago, Lightfoot and even Leela with his remarks and revelations, he does it with the warmest of sincerity, which allows him to build a trusting friendship in a short space of time, whilst maintaining the aura of being 2 steps ahead of everyone else. He is even sincere to H'sen Chang, even though he quickly deduces that he is the person kidnapping the young women. This is done in part due to the fact that Chang is not working alone and has been fooled into carrying out the kidnappings on behalf for who he believes is Weng-Chiang, an ancient Chinese god. Having said that, the Doctor still reserves his rudeness and bluntness for others in the story, firstly with the police when he and Leela are wrongfully arrested. He becomes frustrated by their bureaucracy and mutters insults to himself. Additionally, he later mocks Magnus Greel, the criminal fugitive who has been posing as Weng-Chiang, knowing that he is desperate, and plays for time by commenting on his dirty fingernails and taking his time in showing the key to the time cabinet that Greel desperately needs. The Doctor then further insults Greel's scientific abilities by shooting down the effectiveness of his time travel experiments to make him no more than a murderer on the run. Tom Baker always had this ability when performing as the Doctor to ensure that the limelight is purely on him, with his alien eccentricity and rebellious nature, which would paper over the cracks of the weaker stories of his tenure. But this I feel works even better when dealing with rich storylines, which we have with the Talons of Weng-Chiang. All the characters are great along with the story, but Baker's performance still elevates above them all, and as such you get one of the most all-rounded performances from Baker, displaying all the persona trademarks of the Fourth Doctor that are perhaps highlighted even more due to the absence of props such as his trademark outfit, as well as the sonic screwdriver, and except for the arrival and departure scenes, the TARDIS too. This was Leela's 3rd appearance, having been introduced early in the season in the story The Face of Evil. A savage descended from a human colony, she was envisioned by producer Philip Hinchcliffe and script editor Robert Holmes as an unsophisticated primitive who had learned and developed from the Doctor. This was inspired by the character Eliza Doolittle from the George Bernard Shaw play Pygmalion, with the Doctor being the Professor Higgins type character who educated Doolittle. Due to the Talons of Weng-Chiang and Pygmalion being set in similar settings, you fully get to see Hinchcliffe and Holmes' vision of Leela fully blossom. Firstly, like the Doctor, she is dressed to blend in with the era, and this is the first time we see her not dressed in a traditional animal skin attire, which immediately removes the preconception of her being a savage, as well as toning the sexualization of her traditional outfit by having her covered up wearing Victorian ladies' clothing, although the character comments about them looking silly. The whole point of the Doctor and Leela arriving in 19th century London was for the Doctor to educate Leela about her ancestors, to which she does in the story, initially explaining the natives are known as Cockneys, the purpose of the police, who she describes as blue guards, and being entertained at the theatre, not forgetting Lightfoot's attempts to show her how to eat as a lady. Despite all of this, Leela still portrays her ability to look after herself by being able to take on some of the members of the Tongue of the Black Scorpion single-handedly, as well as bravery and fearless nature by choosing to find Greel's lair by swapping places with one of the victims kidnapped by Chang, trying to tackle Greel herself before making an escape through the sewers, knowing full well she would come face to face with one of Greel's giant rats, which would have killed her had it not been for the Doctor's intervention. Despite her primitive understandings, Leela always tries to show understanding of what the Doctor is talking about and takes her own interpretation of it. A great example of this is when the Doctor explains Greel's DNA helix splitting open as a result of the time experiments and his uses for the kidnapped women, to which Leela compares to a water bag with an ever-expanding hole. This is probably the story where Leela's character fully blossoms. She stripped away her savage iconography, moving the focus onto her persona. The fact that the story has a period Earth setting, as opposed to a faraway planet, space or future setting, means Leela's intellect and understanding is on a par with the majority of the guest characters. This would continue with the following story, The Horror of Fang Rock, which takes place in a similar setting, and once again she is in period dress. For the remainder of the next season, until her departure in The Invasion of Time, actress Louise Jameson would still portray Leela as a savage, but with more understanding of the universe the Doctor has shown her. One of Robert Holmes's best writing talents was the ability to create double-act characters that would feature as either allies or adversaries, and with Jago and Litefoot, you have arguably his finest example. Henry Gordon Jago is the owner of the Palace Theatre, where H'sen Chang performs, and Greel was hiding underneath. He is larger than life, full of bluster, but charming and joyful. The Doctor channels into Jago's persona to win him over, and Jago believes that the Doctor is working for the police. What Jago lacks in ability, he certainly makes up for in charm and likability with his determination to help the Doctor by belief that he is simply doing the right thing. Professor George Lightfoot is perhaps the opposite of Jago in regards to persona. He is a pathologist who comes across the Doctor and Leela when investigating the mutilated body of Joseph Buller, a cabbie who suspected H'sen Chang was involved in the disappearance of his wife and was later killed and fed to Greel's rats. Lightfoot is immediately impressed with the Doctor's level of knowledge regarding the cause of death and powers of deduction, and helps the Doctor and Leela throughout the story. He becomes more involved in the story when it turns out he is unknowingly in possession of Greel's time cabinet. If the Doctor has a Sherlock Holmes aura about him in this story, Lightfoot certainly is his Dr. Watson. Although he is perhaps more toned down in persona than Jago, Lightfoot does share the same determination of helping the Doctor. The pair operate in the first 4 episodes as alternating assistants for the Doctor, depending on his location. The pair eventually cross paths in episode 5 and strike up an instant bond in hunting down Greel and the Tongue, which they successfully do until they are caught. Such was the chemistry and success of Jago and Litefoot that 33 years after the Talons of Wen-Chiang aired, the pair were given their own audio series with actors Christopher Benjamin and Trevor Baxter reprising their original roles. These were released until 2018, with actor Trevor Baxter passing away the year before. Magnus Greel was the Minister of Justice for the Supreme Alliance of the Eastern States in the 51st century, who became a wanted war criminal and escaped using the Time Cabinet to 19th century China. However, the Time Cabinet was taken by Imperial soldiers and eventually ended up in the ownership of Professor Lightfoot's family. Greel then posed as the god of abundance Wen-Chiang and took control of the Tongue of the Black Scorpion, as well as H'sen Chang and the robot Mr. Sin that he also brought from the 51st century and eventually closed in on the time cabinet in London whilst hiding out in the sewers. The time cabinet had a devastating effect on Greel's body, disfiguring him and leaving him to wear a mask. As such, he would use H'sen Chang to kidnap young women off the streets and extract their life force and installing it in himself as a means of survival. Magnus Greel is a great one-off antagonist in Doctor Who, with his dangerous nature being brought about by his desperation to stay alive. As a scientist, he can use his expertise in convincing people that he was a god and taking full advantage of them by putting their own lives at risk for his own personal gain while he hides in a lair in the sewers. His characterization is reminiscent of that of a drug addict, his dependence on absorbing life force to make him feel better, when all the while he is ravaging his body even more, but at the same time has a destructive nature to endanger the lives of those who are even loyal to him. The mystery of the character is well preserved and sustained throughout the story, with Greel and the Doctor only actually engaging in conversation and coming face to face in the final episode, albeit a brief interlude earlier on when the Doctor pursues him through the empty theatre. From the majority of the story, he is referred to as Weng-Chiang, and although the Doctor debunks this earlier on, his true name is not revealed until the closing moments, when he tells the Doctor, who then becomes fully aware of his crimes in the 51st century. Magnus Greel was played here by Michael Spice, who had previously provided the voice of Morbius in the previous season story, The Brain of Morbius, and although he physically plays Greel as well as voicing him in the story, it is his vocal delivery of the part which sells the performance of the character to Magnus Greel wearing a mask to hide his disfigurement, and therefore any emotions he shows are done mostly through his voice. Writer Robert Holmes would dare to use this blueprint of a disfigured antagonist wearing a mask and hiding in a hidden lair in the caves of Androzani with Sharish Jack. H'sen Chang is Greel's aide who carries out his bidding to kidnap young women under the presumption he is serving Weng-Chiang. Chang was a peasant when he took Greel into care when he arrived in 19th century China, hiding him from imperial guards and helping him restore his health. In exchange, Greel gave him the ability to read minds, hypnotize, and other abilities which allowed him to pass off as an unmeasurable magician who would tour while Greel secretly travelled with him. Chang comes across as mysterious, yet gentlemanly and well-mannered. In the story, he performs at the Palace Theatre, which is owned by Jago, with Greel's sewer lair situated underneath. He is also entrusted as a translator for the police to interview a member of the Tongue of the Black Scorpion that Leela caught, not knowing that Chang provided him with the cyanide pill, as the police did not suspect him also working for the criminal organisation. With his powers of hypnotism, he would use women as volunteers in his magic show that he would hypnotise as part of a levitation trick. However, these women would later come to the theatre where Chang would offer them to Greel. Anyone who suspected him would be killed by Mr. Sin. Suspicion later grew on him more though with the Doctor's arrival and Chang's failed attempts to kill him and Greel placing him under greater pressure to supply him with the young women. In the end, when Greel no longer had a use for Chang, he humiliated him by interfering in one of his magic tricks and set him up with the murder of Jago's stagehand, Casey. In a bid to escape, he headed down into the sewers where he was hunted down by one of Greel's giant rats that ate part of his leg. He survived with the aid of opium as a painkiller to take refuge in a laundry warehouse and told the Doctor the name of Greel's new hideout before dying. The behind-the-scenes aspect of H'sen Chang is perhaps one of the most controversial parts of the story, in that he is played by white actor John Bennett, who also appeared in the third Doctor story, Invasion of the Dinosaurs, 3 years earlier. Bennett wore prosthetics and makeup to make him appear Chinese, but I will go more in depth about the controversies surrounding Talons of Weng-Chiang. But irrespective of the choice of actor, I think Bennett pulls off the character well, with equal displays of charm and deception. Mr. Sin, also known as the Peking homunculus, is the murderous cyborg that accompanied Greel from the 51st century. Originally a toy that comprised the robot circuitry coupled with the brain of the pig, Mr. Sin malfunctioned and set off on a killing rampage that almost started World War VI before disappearing with Greel. In 19th century London, Sin posed as a ventriloquist doll that H'sen Chang used in his performances, as well as carrying out killings on the instructions of Chan or Greel. In the climax of the story, Mr. Sin's lust for killing humans gets the better of it. By the means of a laser gun housed in a statue of a dragon, Sin then loses control and goes on a rampage, killing all of Greel's henchmen, before the Doctor manages to disconnect him from the circuitry. Mr. Sin was played by Deep Roy, who stands at 4 foot 4 inches tall, and therefore perfect in playing a cyborg posing as a ventriloquist doll, with conviction, as opposed to the production using limited puppeteering effects. His performance adds to the unnerving nature of Mr. Sin. When I first watched this as a child, it was Mr. Sin that interested and creeped me out the most, with the way he slowly walks up to his victims, wielding a blade, to his childlike speaking and laughter, or the revelation of him having a pig's brain when he resorts to snorting like the animal when he's giving in to his murderous urges. Deep Roy has since gone on to have a varied career on both TV and in Hollywood, having been one of the actors to play Yoda in The Empire Strikes Back, and all of the Oompa Loompas in Tim Burton's version of the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and Keenser in the rebooted Star Trek films. As mentioned in previous reviews, Robert Holmes is arguably the greatest writer to have written for Doctor Who. With the talents of Weng-Chiang, he also acts as script editor, which probably gave him greater control in the content, and here he channels perfectly into the gothic horror themes that underpin the first 3 seasons of Tom Baker's tenure as the Doctor, with the influence and homage to existing films and literature, entwined with his own ability of storytelling and character depth. The influences are plain and obvious to see throughout the story, and Holmes clearly does not try to pretend otherwise. You have the Sherlock Holmes stories in regards to the way the Doctor conducts himself, and giving off the impression that he is a private investigator helping the police, and even his one-off outfit is a clear nod to the stereotypical image of Sherlock Holmes. As previously mentioned, Litefoot also acts as a Watson-style character, and he even has an unseen housekeeper called Mrs. H'sen, which was also the name of Sherlock Holmes's landlady. Coupled with this, you have the ongoing Pygmalion theme between the Doctor and Leela, which is perhaps further concentrated due to the period setting, and the Doctor purposely bringing the TARDIS to 19th century London to educate Leela in her ancestors' way of being entertained. From the antagonist perspective, you also have several allusions to literary and film influence, as well as real-life situations. The theme of disappearing women is clearly influenced by the stories of Jack the Ripper, with a Victorian period and East London setting similar to when the serial killer was at large. Even Jago's stagehand, Casey, refers to the disappearances as being reminiscent of Jack the Ripper. The characterization of Greel is also a mixture of various nods to literature and film. Regarding Chinese culture and the mad scientist persona, there is a clear nod to Sax Rohmer's Fu Manchu character, which were written through the first half of the 20th century. The Fu Manchu influence can also be attributed to both Greel in terms of the mad scientist and H'sen Chang in regards to appearance, in particular his outfit that he wears during his theatrical performances. Greel's hiding in a lair under the theatre and hiding his disfigurement is influenced by Gaston Leroux's The Phantom of the Opera, and is shown as much when the Doctor pursues Greel through the loft of the theatre. The only main difference is that Greel's ulterior motive is a lot more sinister than the Phantom's. This brings me on to my final literary influence, which is Bram Stoker's Dracula. Although Greel is not a vampire, his dependence on the life force from young women and moving around during the night is reminiscent of Dracula feeding on his victims and being dependent on blood. The Doctor even refers to Greel as a vampire as well. Now, regarding the Talons of Weng-Chiang, there is an elephant in the room that I earlier briefly alluded to, and that is racism. Some of the dialogue featured in the story has not aged well in regard to viewpoints of racial stereotyping and negative connotations of today. The story is littered with negative remarks about Chinese people, given the villains are centered around a fictional criminal organization from China. Additionally, there is controversy around the white actor, John Bennett, going under makeup and prosthetics to play Chinese character H'sen Chang, and although Bennett puts in a good performance, there is a question as to whether an actor of Chinese origin was able to play the part at the time. It must be said, though, that Chinese actors were used to play members of the Tongue of the Black Scorpion, with the exception of stunt workers. I will leave it up to yourselves regarding the tone of racism in the story, and how acceptable it is in this day and age. What I will say, though, that it is set in the late 19th century in London, which would have been exclusively populated by white people, and any viewpoint of someone who is not white would have most likely been negative or narrow-minded. Robert Holmes in his script created characters in the story portraying various accents including Cockney, upper-class English, Irish and Chinese, and uses that to weave dialogue into the script that would have been used during that time. On top of this is a story that was produced in the late 1970s, when again the viewpoint of racial stereotyping and connotation was more relaxed than it was today. On top of this is a story that was produced in the late 1970s, when again the viewpoint of racial stereotyping and connotation was more relaxed than it is today. Had the show been written and filmed today, then yes, the dialogue and stereotyping would have been toned down so as not to offend anyone. But as I said, make up your own minds. Talons of Weng-CHIANG was directed by David Maloney, and this was his final contribution to the show, having made his directorial debut in 1968 with the Krotons. Having been no stranger to stories of longer length or comprising of more challenging shoots in the past, Maloney was an obvious choice for taking the direction role. In terms of a challenging shoot, one of the obvious things is the majority of the outside location shooting takes place at night. This may sound trivial in comparison today, but given the equipment needed for the shoot, it would have been heavier and less mobile by today's standards. On top of this, the right use of lighting required would be difficult to judge, especially when trying to give the viewer the impression that it was the late 19th century and not the 1970s. For the majority of these night shots, the areas are dimly lit, with smoke used for additional effect, and it comes off quite convincingly. There is a particular street shot where the residents were requested to move their cars, to which all but one did. As a result, the production team covered up the car with hay to hide it. Most of the outside location shooting took place in London, in areas close to the Thames such as Wapping, which at the time still maintained a lot of the architecture of the 19th century buildings. Some of these places, such as Clink Street, Bridewell Place and the Old Stairs, are still there today with very little change, and it is worth a look. For the shooting of the Palace Theatre shots, the decision was made to use a real theatre rather than replicate one in the studio. For this, the production team used the Royal Theatre in Northampton, which still had decor that resembled a Victorian theatre and therefore did not require alterations. This enabled Director David Maloney to achieve more expansive shots, including the stage, the pit for the orchestra, and the seating areas for the audience, although you only see a small portion of them, I imagine to keep the cost of extras down to a minimum. All this, coupled with Roger Murray Leach's design of dimly lit sets, such as the sewers and Greel's lair, coupled with the authentic period costumes, from which the BBC were even considered experts in at the time, gives the impression of the story filmed on a more lavish budget than it probably was. The only slight weakness was the design of the giant rats, which in appearance do not quite come off, but this is due to the limited capabilities of the time and budget. Thankfully, when they are seen, they are partially obscured by shadow, and a lot of the time, their presence is known by the unsettling noises they give off. Dudley Simpson composed the music here, as he did with the large majority of the 70s film stories, and sticks to similar arrangements of brass, woodwind, and percussion instruments, coupled with an organ to create both eerie and energetic pieces, depending on what the scene required. Additionally, Dudley Simpson also made a screen appearance as the conductor of the theatre band. The Talons of Weng-CHIANG was broadcast in 6 episodes between the 26th of February through to the 2nd of April 1977, and was the final story of Season 14. As well as being the final story of Season 14, it also marked the end of Philip Hinchcliffe's produced era of the show. Having succeeded Barry Letts as producer, with 1975's The Ark in Space as his first story, Hinchcliffe, coupled together with Robert Holmes, brought about the more successful era of the classic series by moving away from the John Pertwee Earthbound stories and reintroducing alien worlds which had been seldom seen in the Third Doctor era, with the reintroduction of period settings whilst maintaining the science fiction elements. As previously mentioned, the era was littered with horror elements from classic Hollywood films, as well as science fiction and gothic literature set in a scary element for the kids, coupled with Tom Baker's eccentricity and humour that made the show as popular as it's ever been. However, with the horror came undertones of violence and suspense, which critic Mary Whitehouse had constantly been calling the BBC out on during the Hinchcliffe era. Due to this, the BBC saw the opportunity to lighten the tone of the show, with Hinchcliffe moving on to producing the gritty police drama Target. Ironically, the creator of Target, Graham Williams, was ushered in as a new producer and shadowed Philip Hinchcliffe for the Talons of Weng-Chiang. Robert Holmes continued as script editor until midway through the following season 15, when he handed over to Anthony Reed. He contributed a further 3 stories throughout the 70s before taking a prolonged absence until 1984 with the 5th Doctor's final story, The Caves of Androzani. Not long after directing the Talons of Weng-Chiang, David Maloney went on to produce Blake 7, another BBC science fiction programme created by Dalek inventor Terry Nation. As such, the Talons of Weng-Chiang represents the end of an era, and it combines all the best of the Hinchcliffe era as one last hurrah before handing over to the new team. You have the allusions to both cinematic and literary horror, complete with dark, scary and tense elements coupled with Robert Holmes' rich script and interesting characters. The design work does not look cheap and is an effective representation of late 19th century London. It has been singled out several times as being one of the greatest Doctor Who stories ever, and Christopher Eccleston admitted to watching it when researching Doctor Who in preparation of him taking on the role. But it is perhaps of its fame amongst fans that in recent years there has been a reassessment of the story in regards to the racial undertones. This is unfortunate as it detracts from an excellent story that is a fine example of this era of Doctor Who. It is understandable for those who would easily be offended by the content to give this one a miss, but for those who want to see 1970s Doctor Who firing on all cylinders, I recommend for people to watch this story and try to see beyond the perceived racism and watch a great tale. So, that concludes my review on the Talons of Weng-Chiang. Of course, it is only my opinion, so feel free to express your own in the comments if you think differently. Be sure to tune in for my next video, but if you do have a suggestion for a story for me to review, then just let me know. But remember, it's the end, but the moment has been prepared for.